Hello class, welcome back. Today we're going to go over chapter 9. So we're going to start looking at social stratification or economic inequality. This week we're going to look at kind of inequality in the United States, and next week in chapter 10 we're going to go a little bit broader and look at inequality at a global scale. But this week we'll kind of stay looking more around our home and our homeland and social stratification that we see within the United States. Another note I just want to make from the get-go here, since we're on chapter 9, that means we are wrapping up unit 2. So make sure you take a look at the course schedule on the course announcements page, and make sure you are aware of when your chapter 9 quiz is due, but also those 2 unit 2 wrap-up assignments, the unit 2 discussion written assignment and the unit 2 exam. And if you have any questions once you look at those announcements and the course schedule, please reach out to me. And I'll be happy to help you with anything you need. All right, so let's get started with chapter 9. So what is social stratification? You may have heard this word stratification before, maybe back in your earth sciences classes in middle school or high school, or geology. But that word stratification, you may have heard when it's applied to like how rocks kind of age over time. So for instance, like these graphics you're seeing on this page here. But sociologists use this word stratification to refer to how people in society, different groups in society, are kind of relegated to certain stratas, certain positions, social standings in a society. And they're, like the rocks, kind of divided into layers. Now, social stratification can be based on all sorts of things, but in our society, as we'll get to in a few slides here, we tend to base our stratification system, our system of social standing or rankings, based on wealth or our income. But we're going to look at some different types. So more broadly, social stratification can refer to categorizing groups of people according to wealth or income, but also things like race or ethnicity, education or power, and status. So society's layers, are made up of people, groups of people, and society's resources are kind of distributed unevenly throughout those layers, with usually the people at the top, kind of having the most access to resources. So importantly, we think very individually, especially in our country. So, just keep in mind, stratification is not necessarily about individual inequalities. There's always going to be individual inequalities, or, some individuals going to be stand out in terms of their talent or their skill. But in sociology, we're more interested in looking at systemic inequalities, or inequalities that come about based on larger social patterns. So things, based on your group membership in a certain class or race or status, and how that might affect, the inequalities of resources in society. So even though we as individuals might support or not support these kind of structural inequalities, social stratification is created and supported by our society as a whole. All right, so 2 terms to get us started, we'll talk about today, we'll bring up the word income and the term wealth. So from the get-go, stratification is kind of based on our wealth and our income in our society, but more so wealth, but we'll get to that. But wealth refers to like the net value of money and assets a person has. Wealth is passed down through generations, through inheritances from your parents and their parents and their parents. And wealth is something that you build up, over a lifetime or over lifetimes, passed down through a family. And it includes not only just, money, but all the assets that you have. Do you own a house, a car, a yacht? How many houses do you own, if you even own any? All of those things, would be encompassed within your wealth, your stocks, your bonds. So the value of all those things would add up to your net, wealth, your worth. Income, on the other hand, is more about, like your yearly earnings, how much you bring in your wages or your salary kind of every year. So, primarily in our society, we have kind of a, we'll get to this in a second, but like a class system where we are stratified according to our income, but also our wealth. Of course, there's other factors that play a role in how we rank people in our society. Things like wisdom, charisma, leadership ability, age, education and occupation. Different jobs have different status levels. Teachers, for instance, a second grade teacher has a pretty high status. People tend to respect that kind of occupation, devoting your life to educating young children in our society. But teachers are notoriously not, especially like, elementary school teachers are not really notorious for being paid, exorbitant salaries, right? So they might be high status, but not high class jobs, if that makes sense. All right, so what are some factors that define stratification? One big one is our parents. So one key determinant of kind of explaining where our social standing comes from is our parents' social standing. Parents tend to pass down, their kind of social position onto their children. So we inherit, not just social standing, right? Our parents raise us in a certain class environment, the kind of house we have, how many cars does our family have, how many kids to a bedroom in our household, do we have to take the bus to school, do we have a nanny, is there always enough food for everyone in the house, etc. All of these kind of questions fall within, like your class position and the way that your parents kind of, in a way, socialize you into a certain class position too, based on their economic standing. And also, they also kind of teach us about certain cultural norms that accompany a certain lifestyle or a certain class position. So social standing, becomes not only something we're kind of socialized into, but also becomes, our comfort zone, our familiar lifestyle, and even part of our identity. So we're going to look at briefly 2 types of stratification systems and then 3 forms of stratification systems. So first here, 2 types are open versus closed. So a closed system is kind of like a closed door. There's not a lot of movement or allowance for movement between social positions in these kind of systems. So you're not really going to be allowed to change your social ranking throughout your lifetime. You kind of have to stay where you were born. And on top of that, you're not really allowed to like be friends with or fall in love with people from a different economic or status level from you, from your own. Open systems are the opposite. Big old open door. They allow movement between different social ranks. They allow interaction and marriage and friendship between different social classes. And social standing is kind of said to be based on achievements, not something you were born into, but something that you earn over time. So we've got open systems, closed systems. And now we'll make a little more sense of that with our three different forms of stratification systems. So we're going to look at caste systems, class systems, and meritocratic systems. So a caste system, some of you may have heard of before in your history classes, but caste systems are notoriously closed systems. They're a type of social system where you are born into a certain social rank, and wherever you're born, that's where you're going to remain your entire life. There's not going to be any opportunity to improve. It doesn't matter how hard you work. You're not going to move between the levels during your lifetime. So a really famous version of the caste system exists in India, even still today, though it's getting a little bit less popular, but a lot of people still do abide by it. But part of the Indian stratification system kind of comes to us from their predominant religion of Hinduism. And Hinduism kind of has this caste system built into it. So you can see in the picture over here, some examples like the bottom of the caste system are called the Dalits, or the outcasts. People who are generally homeless. They, do small odd jobs outside. Above that you have the Shudras, the day laborers, and the farmers, the mechanics and whatnot. Then above that, I'm not even going to try and say these words, the warriors and the rulers. And at the very top of their caste system are the Brahmins, like the priests and the teachers. But, you're kind of born into a certain caste. So if your parents are, Shudras, right, down here, kind of like toward the bottom, then you are a Shudra, and you will be a Shudra your entire life. And kind of accepting your place in society, your social standing, wherever you're born into, is considered like a religious duty, a moral duty. And Hinduism has kind of this concept of like rebirth, right, and reincarnation. So the idea is, if they accept their duty, their religious duty to be within their certain caste, then, maybe in the next lifetime they'll move up, they'll move up a rank to being a farmer maybe, or a trader. So people in caste systems are pretty much expected to work with and marry people according to their caste ranking. These are sometimes called endogamous unions. You have to marry someone from within your caste. You can't, really even be friends with people who are outside of your caste level. And obviously, a lot of caste systems put a big emphasis on things like our fate, our destiny, the fact that, some higher power has, put us into this position in society and it's not our place to question it, kind of. So certainly any concept of like meritocracy or individual freedom and hard work to move up the ladder or down the ladder doesn't really come into play in a caste system, which is why it's a closed stratification system. All right, another system which we're more familiar with in the US is the class system, which is an open system. And class, if you don't know, refers to a set of people who share similar status according to their wealth, income, and kind of secondarily related to education and occupation also. It's also based on social factors, which we'll get into later in the chapter. Things, certain things like our race, our ethnicity, where you live in the country, and also things like your individual achievement and personal choices. But there is certainly room for movement between all of the classes that are in our class system. So we'll go through some different forms of mobility between the classes in a little bit here. So occupation, notably, is not fixed at birth, and you are allowed to have friends and marry people and talk to people and socialize with people from different social classes. So we call that exogamous unions are allowed. Now, a third type of system that sometimes you might hear about is called a meritocracy. And we talked about merit, the importance of like meritocracies when we talked about bureaucracies a few chapters ago. So meritocracy is sometimes called, an ideal system. There are elements to our class system that promote, the importance of merit. However, we'll get into lots of things in this chapter that, kind of stand in the way of a pure meritocracy. So merit basically refers to like your own personal effort, your own hard work, and that alone is what determines where you land in society. Whether you land at the top of the pyramid or the bottom, it's all because of you and either your determination, your hard work over your life, or your laziness, made you end up where you are. And there's no other explanation than that. So meritocracy, sometimes called an ideal system because, there's never really been a society that just purely is based on merit. Usually other unfortunate things come into play, like, inheritance throughout generations of a family, or structural inequalities, which we will get into later. But all of these kind of other things that we see in society that tend sometimes to give some people an unequal access to, the means to be in the upper ranks of a society, and kind of disrupt this notion of like a pure meritocracy. All right, so standard of living. In the last century, there's been a pretty exponential growth in our standard of living, especially in the United States, especially since after World War II. So there's been a dramatic rise in our standard of living. Although, as we'll get to in a while, a very small portion of our society has seen kind of the highest rise in standards of living. But what does a standard of living mean? It's basically kind of like when you have an image in your head of what the average American household should look like. That's kind of your standard of living. So it refers to, the level of wealth available to a certain socioeconomic class in order to acquire the material necessities and comforts to maintain its lifestyle. So, standard of living is based on your income, your employment, your class position, your poverty, and your housing affordability. And it's very closely related to quality of life because, if a certain standard is set forth for us and we don't achieve it, well, you might feel like your quality of life is not so good. But when you think of an average American family, household, what should it look like? Things like home ownership, maybe a certain number of bedrooms. Should there be 3 bedrooms at least? Okay. How many, right? Should there be a backyard? Should there be pets involved? What about a refrigerator, a microwave, an air fryer, a garage, a white picket fence? How many vehicles per adult in the household? Is a standard of living, 1 car per family, or as it more likely is today, it's, 1 car per adult in a family. How much money does a family have to go on vacation or, do fun things on the weekend or buy food or afford, top quality medical care? So all of these things, combined make up kind of the standard of living in, any society. Kind of the average expectation that you might have for a family in that society. And even though it's been rising pretty gradually, especially since World War II, the highest class segments in our society, have kind of seen very exponential growth in their wealth and incomes. So for instance, 1% of the US population holds 1/3 of the nation's wealth. That leaves the other 99%, I sound like Bernie Sanders, with only, with 2/3 of the nation's wealth, while 1% has the other third. And that, why is that important? Because, the wealthiest people in our society have, the best schooling. They have better health care and better health outcomes. They consume the most goods and services. If you're C. Wright Mills, the power elite, he might point out, they wield immense power, decision-making power in terms of, what kind of, leadership, the kind of leaders that are thrown into power in business, in politics, in medicine. And to add to that, there's been some changes since the 1970s. After World War II, till about the mid-1970s, there was a really gradual rise in standard of living across the country for everyone. But some things happened in the 70s, which we'll get a little bit into, particularly next week also, but things like outsourcing of jobs and kind of the deindustrialization of the country, that kind of threw a wrench into this trend of rising standards of living. So we'll get into that more in a little bit. But this, the middle class has been said to have been kind of declining since the 1970s, or at least stagnating, not really, growing at the same pace that it was for a while. However, at the same time that the middle class has been kind of stagnating, we've seen, kind of corporate profits exponentially skyrocketing for the wealthiest among us. So, things like corporate profits increasing by 150% since the 70s. CEO pay has risen by 300%. Meanwhile, a lot of, quote unquote, middle class people who are supposed to have this, comfortable standard of living, are now having to struggle to pay their rent, to buy food, to get by every week, 2 weeks, month, to find stable, long-term work that offers benefits and medical care. All right, so let's get a little bit more into class in the US. So categorizing class and how we talk about it kind of in everyday life, it's sometimes, very fluid. Um, so just for a second, just consider these questions, trying to answer them in your mind. But when you think of, an upper class person, like how much money do you think that person has? When you think about a poor person in the US, same question, about how much money do you think that person has? Same thing for middle class. For instance, do you think someone making $40,000 a year is middle class? What about somebody making $100,000 a year? And then, go a little step further. What do the lifestyles of these different classes look like in your head? What does a lower class lifestyle look like, or a middle class, or an upper class, lifestyle or standard of living? All right, so we generally, think about three different classes in our society: lower, middle, and upper class. However, we're going to break these down a little bit because there's a lot of variation within each of these classes as well. So we're going to kind of focus on wealth here because it's kind of the most significant way to distinguish classes, because wealth, as we said several slides ago, income tracks, what you bring in every year. Wealth is like your accumulated value over your lifetime, even your longer than that. Your wealth can be passed down through families. So it can be passed down from your parents, and you can pass your wealth down to your children. So wealth accumulates throughout the generations, or doesn't accumulate throughout the generations, which we'll get to. All right, so the upper class generally refers to like our top 20% of the population. This class obviously has the most access to money, goods and services, power, influence. They have the power to control their own lives, and also as employers generally, or influencers in other ways, they also have the power to control other people's lives in many ways. So they tend to be, decision makers. They set agendas. They, in many ways, define the identity of the country. And this might, remind you of, the Power Elite reading from C. Wright Mills. But things like, our upper class members tend to be corporate leaders, CEOs, whose decisions obviously, affect the jobs, the life positions of millions of Americans. A lot of upper class people own media outlets, so they can shape kind of the agenda, the collective identity of the nation, what people are paying attention to or not paying attention to. As board members, they help to shape corporate and cultural values and attitudes. And as campaign contributors, if you've taken American government class yet, you'll know that they influence politicians and our political system and fund certain campaigns. So the upper class certainly, through that money, through that wealth that they have and have inherited, have a lot of access to not only money, but also, influence and power. And two distinctions within the upper class. We've got the upper class versus the upper class, and we'll look at old money versus new money. So first, the upper class versus the upper class. So the term upper class, when we look at like government statistics, it's usually applied to when somebody's income is at least twice the U.S. median household income. All right, what does that mean? So if the median household income is, say, $66,000, so to be considered upper class, you would have to make twice that amount of money. So you'd have to make $132,000 or more to be considered upper class, which is generally the level of today. So if you make $132,000 or more, you are you're upper class. However, right, even within this category of upper class, there's a broad range, right, of people who can fall into that category. For instance, right, should somebody who makes $132,000, kind of the very bottom rung of the upper class, should they be put into the same class category as, Elon Musk, Bill Gates, Jeff Bezos, who all have net worths between $100 and $200 billion? You can live a very different life on, $190 billion compared to 132,000. Certainly 132,000 is nothing to look down upon. I think most of us would agree with that. But, the kind of lifestyle you can have between these two numbers, right, or ranges, is pretty drastically different as well. So there's a lot of variation, even when we talk about, this upper 20% of the country, a range of anywhere between 132,000 and $200 billion would fall within that category. So there's a lot of variation, and the super rich, the upper class, the top 1% of the total population is kind of this class segment that's seen like the most exponential growth in the past, say 40, 50 years. So 1% of the population, the upper class, that's only about 330,000 people out of, I think there's over 320 million people in the United States, so a pretty small proportion of total population. But they hold about 30% of the nation's wealth. On the other hand, the poorest 50% of people in the U.S., about 16.5 million people, hold about 2% of the nation's wealth. All right, second distinction within the upper class is this distinction of old money versus new money. If you ever have seen that movie Titanic, it's a little old now. If any of your parents ever made you watch it, there's kind of this consistent theme in that movie of like old money versus new money. But old money, right, refers to people who have inherited wealth through the generations. Their great-great-grandfathers were wealthy and upper class, and then their grandparents and their parents and their children will be, and their great-grandchildren hopefully will be as well. So that's old money. People like the Rockefellers, the Bush family, whose families going back generations have been wealthy, but also been like of a certain class and cultural position. So they've been, considered upper class for, if not decades, maybe even, centuries. And within like this upper class category, this old money category tends to hold, a little bit of a higher status or prestige. And when wealth is passed down in a family like that, that means you're being socialized into certain norms of upper class society throughout generations. And so there's kind of like a whole set of customs and norms and expectations that are, taught to these, old money members that even people who are in the upper class but new money don't really get access to. So new money refers to people who kind of build their own wealth during their own lifetime. So people like Mark Cuban or Mark Zuckerberg, they didn't really come from like upper income um, or upper class, you know, lineages passed through generations. They built, their own kind of empires within their lifetime. And they're not as oriented to a lot of those customs and norms and mores of elite culture, right? Their great grandparents didn't, raise their grandparents to be of a certain, to have certain customs, right? And beliefs and ways of acting and speaking. They may not have gone to, elite boarding schools, and they may not have had a bunch of ties to other, upper class people in their social network growing up. But people with new money, they tend to be pretty proud of what they've done, right? They've built their own kind of empire within their lifetime. So they tend to flaunt their wealth a little bit more by, more kind of things to show off than you might see with old money. Things like a bunch of sports cars or opulent mansions. They might, still have some norms, behaviors, customs that are more acceptable to, the middle classes, the lower classes. And so sometimes, old money, members of old money, may look down upon new money because they're kind of not as cultured, not as socialized into, the the lifestyles of the rich and famous, let's say. All right, so upper class, now we got the middle class, which also has a huge variation to it. So middle class typically refers to like the middle 60% of our population. So upper class is like the top 20%, middle class is kind of the middle 60%, and most people, if we were all in a classroom right now and I went around the room and made you all write down what class you were, upper, middle, or lower, pretty sure almost all of us would write middle class down on that piece of paper. Most people, when they're asked that question, answer middle class. And it kind of makes sense because, this category of middle class is a pretty broad category as well. If you make $30,000, if you make $100,000, make $110,000, you are technically a middle class member. But again, somebody who makes $30,000 and somebody who makes $100,000 is going to live a very different life, right? You can afford different housing, different cars, different vehicles, different clothing, different food, right? All sorts of things about your lifestyle are going to be different based on whether you make 30 or 100,000. But both of those will be classified as middle class. But the main key when people are asked about, what middle class means to them, generally comes down to, a degree of comfort, of not having to, live in like a complete state of emergency all the time. So comfort is the key. Living that standard of living lifestyle, is very key as well. Being able to afford, kind of the basic necessities, and even some luxuries as well. So some distinctions within the middle class. We can also break this class down into, especially because it's so dang broad, you can talk about the upper middle class, the middle class, and the lower middle class. So typically the upper middle class is going to be pretty well off, have pretty high standards of living. They'll tend to be people with, bachelor's degrees or even postgraduate degrees who've studied, business or management or law or medicine. They usually pursue careers with pretty comfortable incomes, 60,000 plus 75, 90,000. And you're able to afford larger home, nicer cars, nice car for every adult, a home with a bedroom for every person, maybe even a bathroom for every person. And you can go afford a few vacations every year, and your children and your family can afford quality education, maybe even private school, and quality health care. The lower middle class tends to be kind of on the other end of the spectrum, starting with the $30,000 salaries. So maybe here you're making 30 to 45,000, on the lower end of the middle class spectrum. And members of the lower middle class tend to hold associate's degrees or bachelor's degrees, usually working in technical fields, lower level management, administrative support positions, and they tend to be supervised by members of the upper middle class. So these jobs certainly carry a degree of prestige, and the pay is adequate. You're still in that middle class category. There's still a degree of comfort that comes with even being lower middle class. You can afford that decent mainstream lifestyle. Maybe you can't get the top brands of everything, but you can generally still afford kind of the basics of that standard of living. But one big thing that kind of marks a distinction between lower middle class and upper middle class is, while the lower middle class can afford that standard of living, they might not really make enough money to build up savings over time to pass wealth down to the next generation. And lastly, we'll look at the lower class here. So change my color up. So the lower class refers to kind of the bottom 20% of the society. So when we're looking at the lower class, you're going to see generally less educational background, probably high school degrees or maybe not even that. And they're going to earn smaller incomes over time. And there's going to be very little, if any, wealth involved here. So a lot of the jobs that the lower class holds, don't require a lot of prior skill or experience. And they're often, doing things like routine tasks under close supervision. So there's some distinctions within our lower class as well. So we'll look at the working class, the working poor, and the underclass. Because of course, the lower class makes about from $0 a year to $29,000 about a year. And you can be qualified as lower class. But again, it's a pretty broad range. If you make $5,000 a year compared to $25,000 a year, neither of those incomes is, ideal, but still, your quality of life at $25,000 is going to be a lot better than $5,000, right? So kind of at the top rung of the lower class is our category of the working class. Usually, holds pretty decent, stable jobs, things like food service, waiting tables, custodial service, landscaping, cooking, building, maintenance. Work that's very hands-on though, and very physically demanding. Usually these jobs pay between minimum wage $7.25 to $15 an hour, but they might offer a few benefits. Maybe they offer some health benefits, or some time off or sick days. Now, the middle position of the lower class is referred to as the working poor. These are people who, work kind of seasonal, temporary jobs, maybe a 3-month job here, then go to another job for 3 months, just depending on, where businesses are hiring during certain seasons of the year. They're generally called, unskilled workers and tend to, work lower paying jobs, more closer to the $7.25 an hour, or even less, depending on where you're working. But work, again, is very hands-on, physically demanding. Things like, being a farmhand or a house cleaner, day laborer. And, again, typically going to make closer to that minimum wage, $7.25. However, since a lot of these workers are in temporary jobs or seasonal jobs, there aren't going to be any benefits, no health care, no retirement, plan building up over time. So it's a very kind of precarious position. You're working all the time, very hard, but in all sorts of different kinds of jobs throughout the year, and there's really no room to, to grow, to save, to accumulate wealth, right, over time. And our last class position, kind of the lowest rung of the lower class, is referred to as the underclass. And these are typically, the underemployed and the unemployed. And, the underemployed refer to people who, maybe every now and then they can, get a little job here and there. They perform pretty menial tasks on a very temporary basis for very little pay. You see a lot of kind of the underclass, especially if you live in a big city, kind of toward the middle of the city, like we talked about in chapter 7, the inner city. That's where, we would qualify a lot of homeless people into the underclass, people who live in really substandard, crowded housing, and people who are very much reliant on, a lot of social services and charities to help with food assistance, medical care, housing, rehab, and job training. So, in one of the wealthiest countries in the world, in the United States, how can we have this whole class of people who, work full time, and still struggle to get by and still be classified as poor, the working poor. They work just as many hours as many people who are in the upper class, right? But yet, can't really get ahead, can't accumulate wealth. So even working full time, a lot of the working poor earn incomes that, can hardly even support even a small family. So for instance, right, the federal minimum wage still is $7.25 an hour. If you work full time at minimum wage, 40 hours a week, bring in a yearly salary of $15,000 and $15,080. And as we all know, those of us who get paychecks, that's before taxes and other deductions are taken out. So probably take-home pay is, I don't know, imagine closer to maybe 10, 11,000 after all those taxes. And about 1/3 of the U.S. population lives on a minimum wage salary of about $15,000 a year. Even more stark is about 1/4 of the U.S. population lives on $10,000 or less a year. So, we'll get more into this next week when we look at global inequality. But two different terms just to keep in mind, even with the poverty that we have in our country, which certainly is real. Also have to keep things in perspective as well, right? So relative poverty refers to, not having the means to live the lifestyle of the average person in your society. So a lot of people who live in, poverty in the United States is more of a relative poverty. On the other hand, absolute poverty, which we'll get more into in chapter 10, refers to deprivation so severe that your very survival is in jeopardy. So keep those terms in mind. We'll come back to those shortly, coming up in chapter 10. Now, really quickly, I've referred to a few times, the importance of class in our socialization process and the importance of our families and, teaching us about certain lifestyles that are associated with our economic position in society. So in sociology, we use this term class traits to kind of refer to that concept. The kind of behaviors, customs, norms that kind of define a class position. So when I asked you earlier, when you think of lower class, middle class, upper class lifestyles, what do you think about? What are you seeing? What different images, activities, hobbies are you seeing in your head? And what you're seeing are probably class traits, these typical behaviors, customs, norms of a class. And they indicate, what kind of cultures you've been exposed to throughout your lifetime. They also indicate the amount of resources and free time that a person has to spend on things like hobbies, leisure, vacations, right? But like the rich people, you might be picturing, some people with some wine on a fancy boat, with some, nice clothing on. Maybe they drove up to the dock with their luxury car. They're off to Bora Bora, going off on an opulent vacation. And then, they'll make sure to go visit, the golf course and the opera and some high-end charity events along the way. Whereas, middle class lifestyle and some lower class, you might be thinking of like going camping or fishing or bowling, drinking beer, going shopping at the mall or TJ Maxx or Walmart, going to the local parade or farmer's market. So those are your class traits. Now, I said we'd talk about some different forms of social mobility. So we're going to look at 5 different types of social mobility here. Pull my pen up. All right. So social mobility, refers to, remember, we have an open system of stratification, which means we can move up and down different class positions. So social mobility refers to our ability to change position within our social stratification system. So when we improve or diminish our status, that means we are experiencing social mobility. So first, we've got upward mobility. Pretty much as it sounds, this is the ability for someone to shift upward in social class, to rise from poverty to wealth, from rags to riches. Of course, in our country, you can certainly move up in class, but as this, interesting little study shows you, where you live in the United States might determine your chances of upward mobility. So for instance, Atlanta on this graph has the highest, marked over it. Okay. Um, has the lowest chances actually of upward social mobility of any city in the country. So you can see the cities that are in, red are where you're least likely to move up in your social position over your lifetime. Yellow, still not so great. And then as you get into like the greens, your chances are getting better. Um, where you really want to live are where things are a little bit more blue or green if you want to move up in your social position over your lifetime. Downward mobility is the opposite. This is a lowering of your social class over your lifetime. So we move downward for many reasons. Maybe a business setback, or you have to declare bankruptcy. Maybe maybe your business is let's say you owned a Blockbuster, right? And then Netflix came around. Well, your Blockbuster probably went out of business. So you might experience a downward mobility after that. Unemployment, not being able to find a job with your degree or skills. Personal illnesses can lead to downward mobility if you're not able to work anymore. Dropping out of school, losing your job, going through a divorce can also result in pretty drastic loss of income and status as well. Intergenerational mobility refers to when you change your class position between different generations of a family. So if your grandparents were poor, they were farmers, and then the next generation, your parents, they studied really hard, they went to school, they got the first high school degree in their family, and they kind of climbed up to the lower middle class. And then they had you, and you worked really hard and got straight A's and went to college, were the first college graduate of your family, got a pretty nice job, and you became upper middle class. That's intergenerational mobility. Between each generation, there's been a shift. In this case, upward in social class. That contrasts with intragenerational mobility, which is when members of the same generation end up in different social classes. So basically, like your siblings. If you and your siblings all end up in kind of different economic positions, then that is intragenerational mobility. So, if this is Brittany and this is Sam. They're both raised by the same parents. But Brittany, she was just always a little bit of a harder worker, a better student. She got a bachelor's degree in business. She now works, in upper management, makes $120,000 a year. And old Sammy, he dropped out of high school. He's always had trouble, keeping a job for very long. Most of the jobs he does have been minimum wage. He hasn't been really good at saving. So Brittany and Sam, they're brother, sister. They're in the same generation, but, they've kind of found themselves in very different class positions over the course of their lives. So that's intragenerational mobility. And the last one we're going to look at, all of the other four that we just went over are all kind of about like, individual changes, individual mobility, or, mobility between generations. Structural mobility refers to kind of like when big changes happen in a society and it affects like entire populations of people in that society at the same time. And in some cases, it might enable entire groups of people to move up in social class. In other cases, it might cause entire groups of people to move down in their social class. But it's like big, large scale changes, almost out of any one individual's control, that happen to society at large and affect a lot of people at once. So for example, I'll talk about the Industrial Revolution again. All right, the Industrial Revolution, factories across the world and across the US, since we're focusing on the US, it wasn't great at first, but over time, factory work raised the standard of living across the country, led to more stable jobs, higher incomes, and that led to upward structural mobility. Entire groups of people in our society were able to move up, to raise their standard of living because of this huge industrial change that affected everyone. On the other hand, in today's economy, we've seen kind of a shift from factory labor to service jobs. And service jobs don't typically pay as well as factory jobs did. They're not as stable as they were either. We've also seen a lot of, like recessions recently. There was the 2008 recession. We've seen a lot of outsourcing of jobs over the past 30, 40 years. Of course, couple that with, everything, COVID and shutdowns and job losses then. So, all those kind of like large scale events, right, have kind of negatively affected large groups of people and caused more unemployment and underemployment, lower wages, fewer benefits, less job security. So that's kind of led to a downward structural mobility. So structural mobility is more of like a sociological term here, like a big event, a big change that affects entire society, leaves, some groups of people with the opportunities to move up with upward structural mobility, and some people, to move downward. Now back to income inequality in the US, just to put it into easy pictorial form for you. Here's, Mr. Minimum Wage Earner. We've got our middle class earner right here, and then our upper class CEO guy. So, minimum wage earner, lower class guy over here makes, $7.25 an hour. Middle class guy makes about $16, $17 an hour, and upper class guy makes about $20,000 an hour. But no matter what, no matter who you are, milk is going to cost about $3.70 a gallon. Okay. So how much, how long do each of these guys have to work to afford that gallon of milk? Well, CEO guy, he, change my color, he has to only work 0.01 seconds, and he can afford that gallon of milk. Middle class guy has to work for 13 minutes, and he can get that gallon of milk. And minimum wage, lower class guy has to work half an hour to get that gallon of milk. So, the discrepancy in how much people, make in terms of their income and their class position also has a lot to do with, again, like our quality of life. How much can you actually afford on that amount of money? Not just milk, but food and rent and vehicle and gas and healthcare and all these other things. So here's a little bit more on income inequality. So I mentioned toward the beginning, especially since the 70s, late 70s, there's been a pretty dramatic change in terms of the growth of the upper class. So here, this graph is tracking U.S. after-tax income, from about 1979 to, I think, 2008. So, and the trend, has not really changed much at all since then. So you'll see kind of all these bottom lines down here. These are all like the growth of, the lower class, the middle class, and even the upper class. However, let me erase that. This top blue line is tracing, oops, switched my pen. All right, is tracing the top 1%. So this top blue line is tracing the upper class and the growth of it over time. So from 79 into like the 90s, a little bit of growth, but then going down, not changing too much. Then you can see kind of around the mid-90s a pretty dramatic growth in the top 1%. And then a little bit of a downward trend there from the year 2000 to, 2003. But then, from then onward, and if I had a more current graph, it would keep going. The top 1% has just kind of exponentially grown, far beyond, where any other class level has grown, right? I mean, even the gray line down here is still the upper class, the top 20%, but they haven't grown as that much. Neither has the middle class or the lower class. We've kind of, a little bit of gradual growth, but certainly not, what that top 1% has seen. All right, so now that I've talked a little bit about income inequality, I have some good videos this week, so hopefully I'll click into Blackboard and look at the Chapter 9 helpful video section. There's a really good one called Wealth Inequality in the U.S. It has some nice graphic breakdowns for you of income inequality. And then there's a really nice, really good little video from Diane Sawyer in 2020. It's called, Is the American Dream Attainable Today? It talks about, kind of the squeezing of the middle class that's happened, especially in the past, 30 years or so. Then let's see, this was a more pretty recent study done on Atlanta and income inequality. But they were studying a bunch of different major cities across the country and found that Atlanta has the largest income inequality gap among all of the large cities in the U.S. So compared to all other major cities, Atlanta has the highest income inequality. I have that link there if you want to, look more into that. But one thing I found in the report I thought was interesting is this top part. In 1970, the poorest 20% of neighborhoods around Atlanta in the 8-county region had roughly 17% of all family income. So that's pretty equitable. It's not perfect. You'd want them to have 20% of all family income since it's 20% of the neighborhood, but it's not too far off. However, that was in 1970. Today, currently, the poorest 20% of neighborhoods have only 6% of income, compared to 17 in 1970. So the income going into the poorest 20% of neighborhoods in and around Atlanta has drastically been reduced since 1970. So I encourage you to look more into that link there. If you want to read more about Atlanta and income inequality trends in our state. And now we're going to turn to another big issue within kind of this topic of income inequality, which is referred to as the racial wealth gap. which essentially shows, that statistically, white people in our country tend to have lower poverty rates overall, and non-white people tend to have higher poverty rates. So, for instance, this graph over here, the dark blue lines are tracing 2005 to 2009. The light blue lines are looking at 2010 to 2014. But let's look, so this is the concentrated poverty rate by race and ethnicity. First, let's just look at the bars over here to the left. So this is like the overall average. If we were to say the average person in the US, or I wouldn't say it like that, we'd say about 13.5% of people in 2014 in the United States were living in poverty. Okay, 13.5, that's not great. But then if we break it down by race, you've got, these are white Americans here. So 5.5% of white Americans in 2014 were living in poverty. All right, now let's look at Black Americans. 25.1% of Black Americans in 2014 were living in poverty. And Hispanic Americans, just under 18% of Hispanic Americans in the US 2014 living in poverty. So this, this average number over here on the left, 13.5, kind of disguises kind of a pretty big gap, the racial wealth gap, between the poverty rates that we see when we break things down by race and racial identity, from 5.5% for white Americans to about 18% for Hispanic Americans to 25% of Black Americans. Now the racial wealth gap, poverty rates, recently have been around 11.4%. That's the average. Again, so overall, all races across America, the overall average is about 11.5% of Americans live in poverty. Again, when we break it down by race, it looks a little bit different. So poverty rates for Black, white, Asian, and Hispanic Americans have all gone down in recent years. So yay, with a rate of closer to about 7% for white and Asian Americans, 15 to 16% for Hispanic Americans, and about 19% for Black Americans. However, if you look over at this graph over here, it's kind of tracking poverty rates from 1959 to 2019. And just kind of look at the trends. You've got the purple line down here at the bottom are non-Hispanic whites. Poverty rate hasn't really fluctuated that much here. Around 7.3% generally. Then, erase that. All right, then we've got our Asian American population. They started tracking them around 1990, 85. So the Asian American rate, poverty rates have gone down for Asian Americans, but landing around 7.3%, very similar to the white poverty rate. But then, see, there's kind of this, let me change my color. See, there's kind of this gap here between Hispanic and Black American poverty rates and white American poverty rates. There's kind of this persistent gap throughout this entire graph, which shows that, like, pretty persistently, white and Asian Americans, tend to have significantly lower poverty rates than Black and Hispanic Americans. So then, we can look at these top two lines. Your Hispanic poverty rate is right here in blue. You're kind of going up, down, up in the 80s, then significantly down, in the 90s, 2000s, a little bit up in 2010, but back down, trending downward to about 15-16%. And, Black Americans have kind of followed a similar trajectory, starting back in, kind of going down during the 60s and 70s, going a little bit up in the 80s, down again, continuously going down until that 2008 recession really hurt. Black Americans' poverty rates went up a little bit there, and been kind of a downward trend since 2015. But still, again, a big gap between, 7.3% poverty rate for white Americans and about 19% poverty rate for Black Americans. Now, one big thing that is usually brought into the debate when you talk about the racial wealth gap is the subject of generational wealth, and particularly the role of home ownership in passing down wealth through generations. So, when typically, if an older mother or father, they own their house, they pass away, and then, if they own their house, then they can pass that house down to their children as an inheritance, as inherited wealth. Then those children then have, an extra, who knows, $40,000, $60,000, $120,000 all of a sudden that their parents have accumulated over time and that now has been passed down to them. And if a certain family has been wealthy for generations, that passing down of wealth just compounds throughout the years. However, due to a lot of social and political policies and practices over, might say, centuries, many Black Americans have not been able to accumulate as much generational wealth as white Americans. So, for instance, in 1963, and this is actually the way racial wealth gap has been kind of getting worse since the 60s, surprisingly. So in 1963, white Americans' median family wealth was $50,000 more than Black Americans' median family wealth. That gap has expanded since 1963. Today, median family wealth for white Americans is around $171,000. Median family wealth for Black Americans around $17,600. So a pretty stark difference in terms of the average white family and what they're leaving behind throughout the generations, and not only the average Black family, but also the average Latino family or Hispanic family. So in other words, the median family wealth held by white Americans is almost 10 times that of Black American families, and a little bit less than that for Hispanic American families. So, 2/3 of family wealth is derived from home ownership. And there's been a lot of, policies and issues over many decades when it comes to, Black home ownership. So, for instance, for a very long time, and some argue that this is still happening today in a different guise, but there was this process called redlining. And that would happen when a bank or a business would refuse a loan or insurance to someone because a certain area, a certain neighborhood had been redlined. It had been highlighted in red on a map, and that meant that the area was poor financial risk. And so you just couldn't even get a mortgage or a loan or home insurance in these areas. And those areas, turns out, tended to be Black or Hispanic neighborhoods. And so there was kind of this systemic, policy from banks and other businesses where, it was literally, you were kind of blocked. There was no way to get a mortgage or insurance in minority neighborhoods. And then another practice that still goes on today as well is called racial steering. And this is something that real estate agents are known for sometimes practicing, which is where they might steer some home buyers away from or towards certain neighborhoods based on the buyer's race or ethnicity. So for instance, if you're a Black American and you're looking for a home, a real estate agent might direct you to, Black, quote unquote, Black neighborhoods, right? Neighborhoods that are predominantly also, populated with other Black, non-white people. And if you showed interest in, a house in a quote unquote white neighborhood, they might even lie to you and say, oh, that house is not for sale anymore. Don't worry about that house. So things like that, practices like this, kind of institutional practices from banks, real estate, other businesses, have kind of systematically, kept a lot of, Black and Hispanic families from becoming homeowners, even if they could afford it. Of course, Native Americans, among all of our minority groups, have the highest poverty rate of all racial ethnic groups in the U.S. Current poverty rate for Native Americans is around 25%, meaning about 1 in 4 Native Americans lives in poverty. Some tribes have reported unemployment rates as high as 85%. And in some of the poorest Native American counties, only about 1/3 of men in those communities have full-time, year-round employment. Native American high school dropout rates are twice the national average. Schools on tribal lands are systematically underfunded, and Native American children consistently earn poorer scores on kind of all the standardized math and reading tests. A lot of homes are very overcrowded on reservations. There's 3 to 6 times higher overcrowded homes on reservations than when we look at statistics of the U.S. as a whole. And only about 10% of Native American land across the U.S. has internet access. All right, so now we're going to finish up with looking back at our paradigms, our 3 paradigms in sociology: structural functionalism, conflict theory, symbolic interactionism. And we're just going to look at, what do those perspectives think of social stratification, of all of these things we're talking about today. Like, what perspective would their paradigm bring to this issue? So structural functionalism, remember, puts a big emphasis on the need for our social institutions to run smoothly, to work together, so that society, can be as functional as possible. So these sociologists, Davis and Moore, kind of came up with their Davis-Moore thesis, which is a very structural functionalist view of inequality, social stratification. They essentially said, the greater the functional importance of a social role, the greater must be the reward. So for a structural functionalist, inequality is okay. In fact, it's even a good thing. So they would say that stratification, inequality represents the fact that there's all sorts of different jobs that people do in society, and that each of those jobs, contributes differently to society as a whole. And that jobs that contribute the most to society, the most value, should be rewarded more than other jobs. So certain tasks in society are more valuable than others. They would say, firefighters are more valuable than a cashier. And that people who, work hard to get qualified for those positions deserve the rewards, to distinguish themselves from others. So rewarding more important work with higher levels of income, prestige, and power is a good thing, because it will just encourage people to work harder and longer, so that they can, be of more value to society and make more money as a result. So kind of inequality, systems of stratification are a good thing for a structural functionalist. They serve society as a whole, because everyone benefits to a certain extent from everyone working as hard as they can to, contribute the most value to society. So inequality is necessary. We need to promote excellence and productivity and efficiency, and inequality gives people something to work for, to strive for. On the other hand, conflict theory would say pretty much the opposite. It's rooted in Marxism, and Marx is all about the bourgeoisie versus the proletariat. And so, inequality for conflict theory is a major problem in society. They would say, similar to the Bernie Sanders line, we need to fight for the 99%, not the 1%. That, inequality benefits very few people and does not really do very much for, the vast majority in society. And they would argue, inequality just perpetuates further inequality. It exists to preserve the rich as rich and the poor as poor. And there's kind of always going to be kind of a contentious relationship between employers and employees, or the rich and the poor, and that stratification only creates class conflict and division between people in society with opposing interests. So a conflict theorist would say, a basketball player should not be making more money than a public school teacher. And certainly should not be making more money than a firefighter. That, people should be, paid more equitably in our society. And lastly, we're going to look at symbolic interactionism and their kind of view. So remember, symbolic interactionism is all about, our everyday relationships, interactions, communication, and what that means in our day-to-day lives. So here, symbolic interactionists are going to focus much more on, like, what does class mean to us on a day-to-day basis? Like, how do we enact our class position in our everyday lives? So they would focus on, the fact that we primarily interact with people and are socialized by people of, the same social rank as us, people who have the same income, education, racial background, taste in food and music and clothing. And so this kind of system of social stratification groups us together, where we're kind of living alongside people who think and act in specific ways throughout our lives. And they would put, a big emphasis on, like, how class is very performative, how the way we speak, the music that we like, the books that we read, the movies we watch, Um, our hairstyles, our clothing, the houses we live in, our style of, what kind of interior design we like, um, what kind of car we have, our personal style. All of these things say something to the world around us about our social status. So they would really put a big emphasis on like how class is very performative, that we almost like put on performances for society to indicate, how wealthy we are or what our personal style is. So symbolic interactionists introduced this term called conspicuous consumption. And conspicuous kind of means like, showing off. So basically, buying things, consuming products in order to show them off. So, if you buy a Tesla or the latest iPhone, you're probably not hiding it away. They would argue, you're getting out on the street and talking about your Tesla all the time, or, you're making sure you're holding your latest iPhone in your hand, almost like an appendage of your body, so that other people will notice and say, oh, wow, you have the latest iPhone. That means, what does that mean about your social status? You must be higher class than I am. So the fact that, we buy certain products kind of with the intention not only to use them, but also to show them off and indicate to the world around us, kind of our social status, our position, our class. So that's conspicuous consumption. And that was coined by this guy, Thorstein Veblen. He was a sociologist back in the early 1900s. He wrote this book, The Theory of the Leisure Class, back in 1899, and that's where this term, conspicuous consumption, comes from. So he has this quote, actually quotes are on the next slide, but he defined conspicuous consumption as, our social behavior through which individuals emulate the consumption patterns of other individuals situated at higher points in the class status hierarchy. So that we buy things kind of with the purpose of like, showing them off, of showing them to the world and saying, look what I could afford. People spend money on all sorts of, goods, products in order to kind of give an indication of our wealth to other members of society. And he talks about, how this search of status through consumption is never ending, especially probably even more so today than when he was writing in 1899. There's constantly a new product, a new thing that you have to have that shows that you are like hip and with it and with the trends and you can afford this. And our economy is always churning out new products, new standards, new technologies, new status symbols, and that you constantly have to, be kind of like keeping up with the Joneses, always getting the newest thing to show off to the world, like, hey, I'm keeping up. I've got the money. I have the class position. I own this product. And some things that, confer status at one time might not confer status anymore. An iPhone 2 no longer confers status that it once did. You have to have the latest edition. So we always have to be buying new stuff. It's a never ending process where we're always trying to distinguish ourselves from other people through, buying products. And a couple little quotes from Mr. Veblen here. We've got this one on top. The basis on which a good reputation in any highly organized industrial community ultimately rests is pecuniary strength. Pecuniary pretty much means like how much money you have. And the means of showing pecuniary strength, and so of gaining or retaining a good name our leisure, and a conspicuous consumption of goods. And then he says in the bottom here, it frequently happens that an element of the standard of living which set out with being primarily wasteful ends with becoming, in the apprehension of the consumer, a necessary of life. Think of an iPhone. When they first came out, a lot of people were like, why do we need this? It's wasteful. Like, we already have phones. Do we really need this? But today, right, it's a necessary of life, a smartphone. And it may in this way become as indispensable as any other item of the consumer's habitual expenditure. So that's Veblen and his term of conspicuous consumption. And then about 100 years later, another sociologist came along named Pierre Bourdieu, and he wrote a book called Distinction, a Social Critique of the Judgment of Taste. And that was in 1979. This is a famous quote by him. Taste classifies and it classifies the classifier. So he writes a lot about kind of like personal style and taste, and how our own taste, our own style is an indicator of our class position, and that it tells people around us in society what our social class is. How exposed have we been to upper class lifestyles or not exposed? And he claims, the way that we choose to present ourselves to the world, our style, our aesthetic dispositions, what we buy, what we wear, what we display, how we decorate our houses, the car we drive, all those things that we choose in our personal style, on another level kind of depict your social status and distance yourself from other groups. And he calls these like symbolic goods that we consume and display, and he calls them the ideal weapons and strategies of distinction. And he claimed, lower classes were mostly, interested in the taste of necessity, just what they can afford, what tastes good, and get them through the day. Whereas the upper classes are more focused on tastes of luxury, things that you don't necessarily need, things that are really, really expensive, but maybe aren't, if you've ever gone to an art museum, and seen maybe some like Rothko, some of the art that's just like one color, and a lot of upper class people are like, oh, upper class taste. It's worth millions and millions of dollars just because it, says something about your status that you would appreciate an artwork like this. Whereas, a lot of lower middle class people would look at a Rothko, just like one color on a big old canvas and say, why the heck would anyone buy, that one color painting for millions of dollars? I'd rather have a print from Walmart that's like of some pretty flowers, right? So like, he talks a lot about, these strategies of distinction, how, the things that we like aren't necessarily, especially like upper class people, it's not that they like them because they're necessarily beautiful or they taste better, or they look better, but they say something, they carry a status, and that's why particularly like upper class people like certain things. So Bourdieu, believes class distinction and our preferences are really marked in kind of just our everyday choices, things that we do and look at and wear every day, or sit on, like, what kind of brand of furniture do we have? What kind of car do we drive? What brands of clothing do we wear? What style? What kind of food do we eat? And where? So I'll leave you, last slide here, with a couple quotes from Bourdieu. So first one up top, he's got, consumption is, in this case, a stage in a process of communication. Remember, we're in symbolic interactionism here. That is an act of deciphering, decoding, which presupposes practical or explicit mastery of a cipher or a code. So he's basically saying like our personal style is almost like a code that we like perform and that people around us have to like figure out. So in a sense, one can say that the capacity to see is a function of the knowledge or concepts, that is, the words that are available to name visible things, and which are, as it were, programs for perception. A work of art has meaning and interest only for someone who possesses the cultural competence, that is, the code, into which it is encoded. A beholder who lacks the specific code feels lost in a chaos of sounds and rhythms, colors and lines, without rhyme or reason. The eye is a product of history reproduced by education. And lastly, okay, so last quote here I've got, and then we'll end. Social subjects classified by their classifications distinguish themselves by the distinctions they make between the beautiful and the ugly, the distinguished and the vulgar, in which their position in the objective classifications is expressed or betrayed. Art and cultural consumption are predisposed, consciously and deliberately or not, to fulfill a social function of legitimating social differences. So again, like all art and cultural consumption, the style that we have, what we like to decorate with, to wear, to buy, right? He's saying, these things legitimate our social differences, our different styles. And all of that is like a product of our socialization into a certain, class position. All right, so that's the end of chapter 9. Chapter 9 quiz isn't too hard, but certainly reach out to me if you look at the review and you have any questions about this week's material or the quiz. And make sure you also look at the class schedule and keep in mind, we're wrapping up Unit 2 with this chapter, so make sure you look at the Unit 2 discussion, the written assignment that's going to be due, and the Unit 2 exam that is coming up as well. So let me know if you have any questions about any of this. If you want me to read a rough draft for your written assignment, happy to do that. And I hope y'all have a wonderful day and a wonderful week. And I will look forward to hearing from you soon. All right. Bye, y'all.